enterprise zones, retiree attraction and recreation, and regional approaches such as the Delta Regional Authority. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Pender. It's all yours, John.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks a lot for organizing this, and also Rosa for your expert help in getting us going. I'm always impressed when the technology works. So this is very nice. So yeah, as Scott said, I'm going to be talking about this issue of rural wealth creation. Myself, Alex Murray, and Rick Reeder recently published a report, an ERS research report on this topic. And so that's what this webinar is going to be based on. Alex and Rick are both here with me. They're not online, but they're in my office. And so when the tough questions come, they'll be the ones to come up with the answers, I think. So, so why are we talking about rural wealth creation? Well, sustainable rural prosperity is a top priority for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and many others concerned with rural development. This is actually one of the pillars of USDA's current strategic plan. And there's growing recognition that in order to achieve sustainable and widely shared prosperity, one has to be concerned with wealth, broadly defined. Some examples of that, for example, the World Bank has completed several studies looking at what they call genuine savings among more than 100 countries worldwide, and they find that they look at various kinds of wealth, not simply physical capital, but also natural capital and what they call intangible wealth. And they find for most countries that what they call intangible wealth, other kinds of wealth besides the usually measured ones, is the wealth that accounts for most of the wealth of most countries, and especially advanced countries like the United States. There's also work by Kenneth Arrow and some of his colleagues that is also trying to measure wealth of nations for a selected set of nations. And they try to specifically measure not only natural and physical capital, but also human capital. And they find that human capital accounts for, according to their estimates, more than 90% of the wealth of countries like the United States, and even developing countries. It's a very important share. So the notion that wealth goes beyond just sort of physical capital goods and infrastructure and also financial assets seems to be gaining traction among sort of noted researchers, noted economists. And certainly when you consider sort of historically research on wealth, people have talked about wealth for a long time. This is not a brand new topic. I mean, ever since Adam Smith wrote about the wealth of nations more than 2 centuries ago, we've had scholars studying various aspects of it. But part of what is missing is, well, certainly it's only been recently that you have scholars really trying to combine these measures to look at multiple types of wealth. And there's also very little research that's looked specifically at wealth in rural areas of the United States in particular, but sort of geographic distributions of different types of wealth has not been well studied. So this study, in this study, we're trying to address several questions. First, what is meant by wealth and wealth creation? And then why is wealth creation important for sustainable rural prosperity? How can wealth be created in rural areas, and considering various kinds of economic strategies? And then why should wealth creation and wealth indicators be measured? And then how can they be measured? I should say that this study is basically a literature review, so it's we're not inventing something new here, but we're adding our interpretations to what we read and have proposed some frameworks and so on that we think might be helpful in understanding the issues. So what is wealth? This figure shown on your screen is kind of a picture. We show a bathtub here, and just trying to get across the basic idea that wealth is something different from income or expenses. So wealth is, in this bathtub framework, sort of analogous to the level of the water in the tub, whereas income is like the flow of water into the tub, and expenses are flows out of the tub. So obviously there's a relationship between wealth and income, but we're trying to clarify that these are two different concepts. One is a flow concept and one's a stock. And of course, if income is greater than expenses, then people are saving and accumulating wealth. And conversely, if they're expending more than their income, they can be depleting wealth. So there's obviously a relationship there. There's also one thing that's not shown in the diagram is that wealth can contribute to income. So the flow into the bathtub itself can be affected by how people use their wealth. Are they investing it in ways that are generating increased income? And of course, wealth can also have other impacts on people's well-being besides its effects on income. So just to define wealth in the study, and this is again based on this review of literature, we define wealth as a stock of assets, a net of liabilities that can contribute to people's well-being. So that's, just restating the same point that wealth is a stock, it's not a flow, so it's different than flows such as income or consumption. It's also, we want to clarify that wealth is something that can be accumulated or depleted over time. So and it's affected by people's decisions. It's sort of endogenous. So when we think about things that are kind of exogenous, there are also things that are exogenous that influence our well-being, such as the amount of radiation we get from the sun. I mean, that's certainly something important for everybody's well-being, but we don't consider it, at least as we're defining it, part of our wealth because it's not something that we're affecting through our consumption and savings decisions. So this definition includes or admits for many types of assets. I mean, certainly when you think about wealth, most people would think of physical assets such as the plant and equipment of businesses, infrastructure such as roads and communications facilities. Also financial assets, people usually think of money. When you think of wealth, common person would think of money or going beyond that to other kinds of liquid financial assets such as stocks or bonds. And then there's certainly in the tradition of economics, there's a long-standing recognition of the importance of what's commonly summarized as land, or more generally natural resources. And we have a whole field of natural resource economics that refers to renewable and non-renewable resources. A lot of literature, especially in the rural tradition, talking about the importance of natural amenities and their role in affecting rural development. And so natural capital is part of it. And then human capital, which was something that, starting with the work of Ted Schultz and Gary Becker back in the 1960s, really sort of made this a common term being used in economics, referring to the kinds of assets that are embodied within people, including their education, their skills, and their health. So human capital has been a sort of a central part of economic theory since the 1960s. So it's already, recognized that wealth is not just sort of tangible physical assets. And then what we call intellectual capital, which you could think of knowledge and innovation. This is actually sort of at the basis of modern endogenous economic growth theory, where economic growth theorists have recognized that in the older tradition of economic growth theory modeling, knowledge and innovation were sort of treated as exogenous, and this modern growth theory has sort of made it endogenous and pointed out that private individuals and firms make decisions and invest in developing their intellectual capital. And intellectual capital is distinguished from human capital by the fact that knowledge and innovation are meant as things that are not embodied, they're not restricted to being within particular individuals. This is like an invention or something that can be shared broadly, in technical terms called a non-rival good, which has, which contributes to its positive potential impacts on economic growth. More recently, you have a large literature developing on social capital, building from the work of James Coleman and Robert Putnam and others, emphasizing the role of social networks, norms, and trust. The idea that people make investments in their social networks and their social capital, and then this is also important for economic development. You have some literature that also refers to political capital, which relates to the relationships of political power or political networks. One might even think of that as a subset of social capital, but we're kind of trying to be inclusive here and we're not getting too hung up on how you distinguish all of these terms. But so political relationships matter, and then cultural capital, which you can think of the values and traditions of particular societies, their arts, or ways of understanding things, and there's probably some debate about whether that is appropriately seen as capital. Actually, there's debates about all of these, but certainly, things like social and cultural capital, you can just debate whether these are, sort of actually things that people invest in, or are they just more part of the context. I personally think that cultural capital is something that can be changed through people's actions. It may be slowly changing, but it can also be rapidly changing if, for example, economic development leads to an undermining or a depletion of existing cultural traditions. So, and one can also think of building on cultural assets, where you have some examples of rural development where people are building on the cultural assets that exist in particular locations. So that's kind of some examples of those ideas. Let me move to the next slide, so to go beyond talking about what is wealth and to talk about why is creating wealth important. Well, if we think
John,
about the fact that,
John, did
sorry.
you want this question 4?
Oh, sure, you can go ahead and post that. I should mention that we have a few questions as we go along that people can respond to, or you can wait until the end if you like. Scott, I have kind of I don't know if, is there a way to do this where I can actually see the screen and keep referring to the screen, or should we just?
Let me see if this one's kind of a longish one. Let me see if I can do that. Let's shrink this down a little bit and bring it down. Hopefully people won't get too dizzy looking at this. Okay, hopefully people can see that. If not, and while I'm on, Debbie Cox in North Carolina, the PowerPoint and the recording will be available on our website after about a day or so. And I think John is talking off of an ERS publication that's probably a reference to that later.
Yeah, in fact, sorry, I should have put the our website link for this report. But if you just go to the ERS website, which is www.ers.usda.gov, and then go to publications, this is listed under our economic research reports. It's economic research report number 131. But if you also just search for wealth creation, you would find it.
I'll put it in the chat box here while you're talking.
Okay. So, so the next question that we try to address is, why is this topic important? And I was saying that it's almost, in a way, it's almost sort of tautological to say that if wealth consists of those things, those assets that contribute to well-being, then in order to improve well-being, then one needs to invest in wealth, and we recognize that there are many different types of things that one can invest in that contribute to well-being. Now we're not quite as tautological as some people like Kenneth Arrow and his colleagues. They've actually proved a theorem in one of their papers that improvements, sort of sustainable improvements in intergenerational well-being occur if and only if investments in comprehensive wealth as they defined it have occurred. It's a bit tautological in their case, more so than our case, because they define wealth as a social net worth measure, and it's measured using sort of shadow prices that reflect the actual value, the social value of everything. So if you had shadow prices, if you knew those, then almost tautologically, any investment that you make, if it has a positive shadow price, is going to increase well-being. What we're allowing for is we say that wealth may not be, investing in wealth is a necessary thing, but it's not necessarily sufficient. It depends on what kind of wealth you invest in and what the returns are to those investments. So wealth can contribute to well-being in many ways. Obviously, Many kinds of wealth contribute to income, having dividends from your stocks, for example, or the earnings that you earn from whatever types of productive assets, if it's farmland or whatever. But wealth can also contribute to well-being beyond affecting income. For example, it may give people new opportunities, that not just about current income, but they may have opportunities for future income. It may contribute to their aspirations, and especially in societies where people have very little wealth, their aspirations may be limited because of that. It also can contribute resilience. I've seen one article or one argument recently that wealth can sort of, especially financial wealth, can act as sort of a like potential energy in physics, that even when it's not being spent, it can have a value because it may provide sort of insurance and protection against adverse events. And then wealth can also confer status and power on people and give them sort of opportunities to take advantage of opportunities or to be resilient in the face of adverse events because of that status and power. And then, since wealth matters for not, for all people, then it certainly matters, of course, for poor people, and their potential for moving out of poverty is going to depend on what their wealth is. And it's sort of unfortunate. It's been pointed out that a lot of the welfare programs that we have in this country have been focused much more on sort of supporting income, but not on wealth. And so it could be that you support people's income, but if they remain poor in terms of assets, that they're going to continue to be poor. And in fact, some of the welfare programs have traditionally kind of discouraged, they haven't always contributed or, encouraged wealth formation because if you had more wealth, you actually didn't qualify for some of these programs. So focusing only on, it's obviously now in the context of the recession, people are very focused on jobs, and so on, and increasing incomes. But focusing only on jobs and income may lead to poor policy targeting or ineffective policies. You may be able to contribute to jobs today, but you may be targeting people who are wealthy already, and not addressing, say, the poverty problem. So and sort of related to that is, if you support, there's a lot of effort to improve people's incomes, especially at the lower end of the income distribution. But there's evidence that even people that have like minority groups, for example, there's evidence that there, even among minority groups that like African Americans that have as high of income and as good of education as whites, they tend to have less wealth. And so distribution of wealth is more skewed than income among households. And that contributes to kind of continuation of kind of disparities in the society, even when income is becoming, even when income is, inequality is addressed, there's still the wealth distribution that's a concern. So there's a bit of evidence, on the distribution of wealth across households from national level surveys. There's much less known about the geographic distribution of wealth, and that's one of the things that we're hoping to try to encourage more research on, as well as more data collection. The next. So then we talk about how can rural wealth be created, and maybe it's sort of an obvious point, but we have a couple of basic points here in terms of principles. And one is that basically creating wealth requires investment, and it requires not simply investment, but investments that are socially profitable. And so we say socially profitable because it's possible that you may make investments that are privately profitable but socially unprofitable if there are sort of negative externalities, negative spillover effects of those investments, such as environmental damages and so on. So one needs to look at the broader kinds of set of outcomes and not just the private profitability to say whether this is actually improving people's welfare in general. And a basic kind of hypothesis or theme, I guess, in our research is that rural America is very diverse. There are many diverse contexts, and there are many different types of assets that people can invest in, as I've pointed out. So it's kind of a complex problem to identify sort of an appropriate portfolio different types of assets that can be invested in that will be socially profitable. And then another sort of point that adds to the complexity is that you have multiple actors that are important in making investments. So it's not just, certainly private businesses and so on, private individuals make investments, but and affect wealth creation. But then you also have local governments or governments at different levels that make investments in different types of infrastructure, for example, or different assets. You have public as well as private assets. And so these are parts of the complexity of the issue. Then you also have, as I said, very diverse local contexts. And so what can be effective in terms of identifying socially profitable investments and achieving success is going to depend on identifying sort of strategies that are suited to the diverse local context in terms of comparative advantages, and then also taking into account kind of diverse outcomes and feedback effects. So these are kind of some of the elements that we're trying to take into account of the complexity of this issue when we defined our conceptual framework. So on the next slide, I'm showing this conceptual framework for rural wealth creation, and this is something that we've developed. It draws upon, there are a number of frameworks that are out there in the rural development literature. One of the things we have in our report is an appendix where we review some of the international literature on agricultural and rural development, as well as the domestic US literature. And it's kind of interesting that these different literatures don't really seem aware of each other very much. So there's some aspects of sort of reinventing the wheel across these literatures. But I think what we're presenting here is kind of a synthesis to a large extent of some of these different literatures. And basically we have sort of four main boxes in this framework. We put at the center of the framework the local actors. I should say, our framework is really meant to be focused on local decision makers. So by local, I mean that can be varied, but we're thinking of like rural communities in the United States, typically a town, but this can be applied at different scales. But we're thinking of, in a local town or community, you would have, individuals and households, you have businesses, local governments, of course, and civil society organizations, and all of these actors can influence what happens in terms of the effectiveness of a local development strategy. They make decisions about their livelihood strategies, what occupations are they going to pursue, what activities they're spending their time on, what enterprises do they invest in, so what kinds of investments do they make, what do they produce and consume. All of those decisions will then lead to various outcomes. And then those decisions are affected by the kind of wealth that people have at the local level, both sort of community kinds of wealth, like local infrastructure and things, as well as individuals' ownership of and different types of assets. So the idea here is that these different endowments will affect the development, the potentials for different development approaches, different decisions and strategies that people can make. It also depends, people's wealth and their decisions depend also upon the economic, institutional, and policy context. So when I say context, I'm referring to things that are both sort of part of the temporal context that may change over time, as well as the spatial context, things that vary from one community to the next. So you can think of markets and technologies as they develop. They change the prices of things. The prices of assets can change, for example, and that may change people's wealth endowments. Changes in laws and regulations and policies may restrict or create new opportunities for different types of activities and strategies. And then whatever strategies are pursued will lead to outcomes, not only economic, such as employment and income effects, but also other economic effects, such as impacts on economic wealth, social impacts. So what happens, in terms of social capital, for example, other aspects of social impacts would be important. And then, of course, environmental impacts. And then these arrows that are in the diagram indicate that there are feedback effects. So if you're going to understand the dynamics of development, then you have to understand what's happening in terms of, as decisions are made and they lead to outcomes, those outcomes and decisions will have feedback effects on the levels of capital that exist in a community. And so that's what kind of contributes to the potential dynamic, either for sort of downward spirals if you're just consuming your levels of capital, or upward growth paths if people are investing and improving their levels of capital stock. So let me go to the next slide. So we kind of discuss in the report and extend it. We have an example that we use to kind of illustrate some of these issues. So we took the case of the recent boom of ethanol production in the last decade in the Corn Belt of the United States mainly. And so we talk about first, what are some of the contextual factors that affected that boom? And we talk about, some of the obvious ones are, of course, the sort of temporal contextual factors like the federal and state policies, which came in and in some cases required greater use of ethanol and also provided incentives for using it with tax credits and tariffs and so on imported fuels. You had sort of favorable prices of inputs, especially for corn for a time where you had, during the mid 2000 period, you had corn prices sort of not rising as fast as fuel prices, and so that gave a boost to profit margins for ethanol production. I'll just shift to the next slide to show that in around 2005, 2006, the prices for ethanol fuel were rising pretty rapidly as a result of new demands and so on, rising oil prices, and yet the corn price was still, the red line is still pretty stable for some time, and so the profitability, this yellow line of ethanol production, went way up. And so naturally, a lot of people were attracted into investing in that. Of course, as a lot of people invested in ethanol production, then this context changed, and so the market became more competitive. The cost curve rose to kind of meet the demand, the price curve, and so the profit margins were driven down, as sort of economic theory would predict. Profits were driven down, and so another point here is that the context in that sense is also changing. You also had technological changes, improvements in the efficiency of ethanol production, sort of expanding scale of plants, which made them more technologically efficient and economically efficient. So those are all kind of sort of temporal, part of the temporal context. And then you have things that vary over space, like proximity to markets and transportation infrastructure. So there have been studies that show that a lot of the ethanol plants that have come in have been in places with favorable access to markets and to urban markets and to transportation infrastructure. Also access to the feedstock in places with good rainfall, such as the Corn Belt, and also having productive farmland for producing that feedstock. Other natural resources being important, like availability of water for irrigation in places where that was used, and for processing, and then access to financial capital. That was something, certainly some of the farmer organizations that got involved in ethanol production were able to provide capital, at least for some of the smaller scale, not the really large scale plants. That became more of a constraint eventually. But then human capital is also important, especially the sort of availability of entrepreneurs and skilled labor to operate plants. And that, I think, is probably more important for the locally owned plants, because a lot of the externally owned ones brought in their own management teams and so on to a greater extent, I think. And then social capital, ensuring that there's sort of local social support for these developments is also part of it. And at least in the initial, I think in this period when the farmer-owned plants were coming in, that probably played an important role. So here coming to the box where we're talking about local actors and their roles. I mentioned the role of farmer cooperatives and other local investors, which was quite important early on in this boom period. And then you've had sort of external corporate investors that have become increasingly dominant since that period as the scale of the plants have increased and the competition has increased. So actually some of these farmer-owned plants have gone out of business or aren't doing quite as well. There's also, many efforts by local governments that have contributed through various financing schemes, provision of land, assisting with land improvements, and so on, providing permits, all of that, kind of is also supportive or, important as far as achieving these investments. And then we talk about the role of local community organizations, sometimes supporting, sometimes opposing development of these plants. So that's part of the kind of social aspect that relates to this development. And then there are various outcomes. There's a fair amount of literature that we've reviewed looking at, economic outcomes from ethanol production. Obviously, increased local employment and sales. There's some evidence, that some of these employment and income amounts were greater where you had local ownership. At least, when there was a high sort of profitability of ethanol production, then the dividends are going to local owners of the plants, and then that's money that's, increased amount of local income that's circulating in the local economy. So you can have greater impacts from local ownership than from external ownership. Although the flip side of that is that as the profitability has gone down for these plants, then the benefits of having local ownership in terms of how it ripples through the economy has also gone down. There's some evidence on impacts on local corn prices with a local corn price premium, some evidence on increased farmland values closer to ethanol plants kind of linked to that price premium. There's more limited evidence. It's actually less clear yet, I think, on the overall effects on property values and tax revenues. But there's some studies that find some increases in those property taxes and other tax revenues. I think I mentioned that the impacts depend on some of the context, like how diverse the community is, whether the ownership is local or absentee, and so on. So I guess this is just making the point that there's a lot of sort of context dependence of these impacts. We also reviewed some of the literature on environmental impacts. Generally, in the case of ethanol production, there's not, as major of environmental impacts as some other kinds of developments you can think of. But one of the largest one is the sort of large demand for fresh water, and so it puts a pretty significant strain on local water systems for this kind of processed water. Social impacts, there's some anecdotal evidence on concerns raised about noise and traffic congestion and so on. But there's not been much, as far as we could find, rigorous study on the social impacts. Most of the literature on social impacts of ethanol production are more focused on international impacts on sort of food security in developing countries and so on. And then kind of completing the set of issues from our framework, we looked at feedback effects. And I mean, I should say that basically what we're doing is using this framework to kind of help us review the literature and find out where the gaps are. And so I would say that where we found gaps were, as I mentioned, looking at social impacts was one case. And then a lot of these feedback effects, we really didn't find much literature that really documents or investigates feedback effects on how does this development, lead to changes in assets over time of different types. And then it can not only affect, the effects of assets through, let's say, collection of tax revenues, and investments that may result from that, or negative effects that, if you have negative environmental or social impacts that might, lead people to leave a community or whatever, so reducing the human capital in that case. So those are all hypotheses, but we haven't found much literature that actually investigates that for the case of ethanol. And actually in most kinds of wealth creation or most kind of rural development strategies, you find little literature that traces those dynamics. And then, in a larger sense, you can think of the impacts of some development can aggregate up to have broader impacts on the sort of context within which things are happening. So, for example, in the case of ethanol production, as if it happens on a small scale, it doesn't necessarily affect prices very much. But then as it really started expanding rapidly, then you saw the price of corn being affected by that. So that starts to feed back and influence the profitability of that activity. And also, people's attitudes about something as it scales up and they start becoming more familiar with it, it may lead to changes in the initial policies that were promoting that activity. So just to kind of summarize some of the implications that we drew from this example, but I think these are some issues that are probably more true, and that we hypothesize anyway are likely to be important in general. One is that the rural wealth creation and what strategies can achieve it is going to be highly context dependent. So there's not going to be a sort of one size fits all solution, and we need to think more broadly about multiple kinds of strategies that can work in different contexts. Secondly, there's interactions among different types and sources of capital that are important to consider. So, for example, in the case of ethanol, you had the private investments in plant and equipment, but then that was also the effectiveness also depended on kind of prior investments in infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and so on. Having the available water supplies and other things. So it's these, in many cases, you have sort of complementarities that are important between different types of assets. But you could also have substitution relationships where it may be more effective to invest in one kind of asset instead of another. So for example, you might reduce greenhouse gas emissions more effectively by planting trees than you would by investing in ethanol plants. So that, I mean, it's just an example that there's also substitution possibilities between different investments. And then the dynamic sequence of investments can create new opportunities or undermine future prospects. So for example, this hasn't been well studied, but as you have a new opportunity and it generates new tax income, new income in general, that can lead to greater investments, and those investments, if they're effectively made, can attract new people to the community and open up new opportunities. On the other hand, if you're making investments that lead to congestion and pollution, to undermining the quality of life in a location, then that may actually undermine the attraction of a community for people, and so you can undermine your prospects depending on what kinds of investments are made and what their impacts are. Another point that comes out of this is that wealth creation, as any investment, it involves risk, and so having another reason for thinking about a multiple types of wealth is asset diversification, which might help reduce risk. So an example in the case of ethanol could be that if you have a community that's totally dependent on corn production for its income, if the price of corn falls, then they're going to be suffering quite a bit. And if they've also invested in ethanol production, then if the price of corn falls, then their profitability on the ethanol may actually increase and help to offset that risk. But then there may also be joint risks there that are faced both by ethanol and corn production that you need to diversify into other kinds of assets and activities to address those risks. Another point that we saw in the case of ethanol is that having local ownership of those investments can lead to greater local economic impacts, greater local returns, especially when there's a high profitability of those activities. So during the mid 2000s, when ethanol was very profitable, then the spin-off benefits or the ripple effects were very positive for locally owned plants, but it also involves a risk. And so as the plants have become less profitable, and even in some cases unprofitable, then the downside can also ripple as well. And so, when you have a plant fail, then that has negative ripple effects in a local economy. And then the final point here is that it's important to consider multiple outcomes of wealth creation, so that as I said, you have not only economic but social and environmental impacts, and these can in turn feedback and influence your kind of change in assets, endowments of communities over time. So if you invest in physical capital, but you're undermining the human capital by if a place becomes less attractive place to live and then people move away, that's you may be undermining your sustainability of your development. So then in the report, we talk about various rural wealth creation or economic development strategies as means of wealth creation. And I think the main point I want to make from this slide is that there are many different kinds of strategies. I mean, we present a sort of classification of more traditional strategies like natural resource-based industries, recruiting, manufacturing, or other footloose industries. Some people call it smokestack chasing. Then you have sort of developing as regional centers or as bedroom communities. And then more recent years, you have people focusing on cluster-based development, amenity-based development, local foods or other import substitution strategies. These are all, I think the point is that all of these strategies depend on particular local contexts, and you can't pursue the same strategy everywhere. And they also depend on the kind of asset endowments that people and communities have. So, you may need to have, sufficient sort of natural, sort of suitable natural amenities, for example, to base an amenity-based development strategy on. But then you may need other kinds of assets as well to attract residents as well as tourists. And so the point is not that you can sit and plan from the top and say here's what everybody needs to do, but you can try to learn from what's done in different contexts of the country and say what kinds of strategies seem to have possible potentials in particular areas. And so there is some literature on sort of research-based industrial targeting approaches that can be helpful, but that's kind of we argue is going to be most helpful if it's linked into a strategic planning approach where communities themselves have develop the capacity and are able to sort of be in the driver's seat and make decisions about what will work in their context. So we have a bit of discussion about that in the report. Then we talk about why measure wealth indicators, and we discuss reasons to do that as well as some reasons why you might not want to do that. So I mean, in order to understand what's going on in rural development, there are some things that, I mean, most commonly we analyze data that's available on jobs and so income and employment, and those are certainly important measures, but they don't necessarily reflect everything that's important in a rural economy. I mean, a lot of times you may have an investment that, for example, has a long-term impact on a community, but you may not see immediately an effect on income or employment. You can think of like investing in water and sewer systems, for example, very important to the quality of life and maybe very important to incomes even in the long term. But if you just ignore that asset effect, you're missing an important part of the story. And then kind of related to that is sort of attributing impacts to programs that the investments in different types of assets are often the sort of intervening factor between some program or policy investment, and then what happens to incomes and other kind of flow measures. It's going to depend on those intermediate sort of assets being available and producing useful outcomes. So kind of understanding how to attribute the effects of a policy will be related to that, to understanding impacts on wealth. Now, there are various reasons you wouldn't necessarily want to measure wealth indicators or all kinds of wealth. And that's one is, obviously it's not always feasible, or it may be costly to measure some different indicators. And then sometimes the concepts may be better reflected by stock measures. So we give some examples in the paper on that. So and then one point, so how can you measure wealth indicators or measure wealth? And we argue that how you measure wealth depends on the specific purpose. So if you're trying to identify and diagnose and target interventions, then you need sort of broad-based measures that are available for, let's say, large regions or for a lot of the country. And you're going to tend to be reliant upon publicly available data. And some examples of this have been, as I mentioned, the work by the World Bank and Kenneth Arrow and others, where they're trying to measure sort of how wealth changes in entire nations. The idea being is you can try to put an assessment on, understanding even if GNP or GDP is increasing, if nations are depleting their capital stocks, you may be misunderstanding how well they're doing. And so that's part of what they're trying to do there. So, and we review those approaches, and then we see that there's a lot of strong assumptions that are required to put sort of monetary values, in these efforts to kind of put everything into a monetary equivalent of wealth requires a lot of strong assumptions about, for example, the substitutability of one type of asset for another. And if assets are not all, fairly easily substitutable, then it may not be an appropriate assumption. And this is one of the arguments of the literature on strong sustainability that argues that some types of natural capital can't really be substituted for, and so trying to put a price on that is problematic. So, and then there are also, other problems with the assumptions. So we kind of side with the point of view that you can develop a set of indicators rather than just a single monetary value for all of wealth. And you can think of having monetary values for those things that have fairly well-functioning markets and where you can establish substitutability. But for other things, maybe you need just individual indicators. And so in the report, we kind of talk about a set of indicators, and we give examples using publicly available data sources that could be used to measure indicators of these 8 different types of wealth. Another purpose of measuring wealth is to try to improve the design and monitoring of interventions and programs. So this kind of purpose can be, here you can draw upon the specific, what you're trying to do with a particular program, and also the kind of administrative data or program data that might be available for that program or that could be collected. So in this case, we draw upon something called logic models or impact pathway analysis, where you try to think through what's the sort of theory of impact of the program. So how does it go from inputs and activities to its outputs, and then ultimately how do those outputs lead to outcomes and impacts? So you want to kind of think through those impact pathways, and then as one is thinking those through, you can derive wealth indicators that might be helpful in understanding sort of in real time what's happening, and then understanding how things can be improved as a program is being implemented. So we have an example in the report that kind of draws from our conceptual framework. So we have different colors representing different elements in our framework, but then it shows, like, for example, types of capital are shown in green. I mean, here we're taking an example of a loan program that encourages development of a community facility, in this case a hospital. And so the type of capital that's initially developed is a physical capital, that hospital, and then that can lead to greater employment of people in the construction and operation of the facility. And so that may attract in additional people, which the workers in the hospital and so on, which would be human capital. And then also it can lead to increased access and utilization of healthcare services, which of course may attract people to the community as well, and may improve people's health, both of those leading to improvements in human capital. It may increase the property values and housing values to have a better health facility, so that's another type of wealth that's being increased, and so on. And then in the longer term, you may, having better health may lead to better productivity, which can lead to further growth and employment and human capital and so on. So there's kind of a, not all these things happen at the same time. There's a cycle of effects that can occur. So the point is that one can start thinking through these kinds of impacts, and then identify various kinds of capital that are hypothesized to be affected. And then we identify some data sources from publicly available data sources that could be used to assess that. And then a final example or purpose is to assess impacts of interventions. I mentioned this issue of attribution challenge. It's difficult often to say what the effect of a particular program or intervention is, because we don't observe the counterfactual. And if we could do random experiments everywhere, then that's one approach to try to address that. But another approach that we've used and many others have used is to try to identify counterfactuals from just sort of quasi-experimental designs to understand, look for places that have similar characteristics, and then see what happened in those places to the places that you're trying to evaluate. So an example of that type of study that uses some wealth indicators to identify, suitable counterfactual is a study that Rick Reeder and I did recently, where we looked at the economic impacts of the Delta Regional Authority. And we use indicators of some types of capital to identify counties that were similar to DRA counties in terms of their initial physical, human, and financial capital. And then we looked at how those counties changed over time after the Delta Regional Authority was established, and we found positive effects of the DRA on income. So brings me to the last slide, which is that just to summarize, that this idea of investing in a broad portfolio of assets in order to achieve economic development is not new. What we think is new is to try to broadly conceptualize and measure the wealth impacts of rural development approaches, and in particular to try to understand context. So, what works where and why or why not in promoting rural wealth creation, and also as a part of that to understand interactions of different types of wealth and their sort of dynamics. How do different types of wealth become generated and contribute to a dynamic process, either of improving or depleting wealth over time. And of course, to be able to do that, we need to know more about how can one measure wealth in rural areas. And so we've seen this report as a starting point, really, in trying to encourage research on some of these issues. We think there's really a lack of research on many of these areas, especially on the interactions and dynamics of wealth as it relates to different rural development strategies. And so that's basically what we're arguing for in this paper. And I guess that's it.
Thanks, John. That's a nice overview of a very thorough report, and you've had kind of the luxury of going through and looking at a broad range of literature in developing the report. And those of you who are wondering about the report, I did put a link there in the chat box about how to get to that, and I will post that also on our website next to the archived version of this webinar. But I wanted to ask, you go back to that early slide you showed on the bathtub and the wealth kind of accumulating in the bathtub. In your literature, have you seen anything that talked about encouraging, and you discussed it a couple times in what you said subsequent to that too, of this kind of longer term view which affects willingness to engage in savings behavior, it affects willingness to make the long-term investment in the sewer system and things like that. And it seems like over time, if anything, as a society, we seem to be more and more short-term in our perspective and how people handle their personal finances and also the public investments. And can you talk a little bit about that? Is there anything out there in the literature that addresses that? Are there examples of how that has been successfully turned around to get people to take a longer term perspective?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll just repeat for my colleagues here. Scott was asking about, is there anything in the literature addressing the short-term perspective that people seem to be taking, and they shorter-term perspective now than perhaps in the past. I don't have a quick answer for that because I didn't, we reviewed a lot of literature just to get to this report, and there were so many topics. But I would say that to me it's a little bit of a puzzle in the sense that right now we have interest rates that are historically low. So according to economic theory, the interest rate that people pay should relate to how they discount the future. So if there's ever a time when people were going to take a long-term view, it ought to be when interest rates are low, right? But there are a number of reasons why people don't necessarily discount the future at the market rate of interest. One is if they're facing credit constraints, and so a lot of people may be not able to borrow at those low interest rates and so on. So they may not be that relevant, so that may be part of what's happening too, is at least in the current environment, there could be, a sort of short-term perspective because of when things are really kind of bad economically, people are constrained, and then they tend to just focus on today, and then it's hard, one could speculate about the sort of political environment. I mean, I just saw a report that came out from Brookings Institution from Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann talking about how the political situation seems to be becoming more and more polarized, much more than it used to be. And so it seems hard to take a long-term perspective, especially on things like public investments and so on, and some of this very extreme, partisan debate that we have nowadays.
Well, yeah, I think
I don't know
it
whether.
seems to predate the credit crisis. And by the way, those of you who are participants, if you've got questions, please type them into the chat box, and we'll address them as they come in. But a couple of weeks ago, Abner Womack was giving a webinar, and he had done some really careful work looking at debt in American society. So this is consumer debt, this is local government debt, this is federal government debt, all different kinds of debt. And over the last decade, the amount of debt that's held anywhere in the U.S. is just skyrocketed. All different forms of debt. Student loans, credit cards, housing, bonds, all that. And so what's driving that? Why are we so interested in getting into debt and not so interested in savings and thinking about the long term? Why are we buying a lot of stuff and not saving anything, basically?
We did comment on sort of a little bit on that issue in the report, where we discuss the issue of sort of capital gains. Part of what has contributed to a low savings rate, as I understand some of the literature, was for so many years you had housing price, you had a stock market bubble, and then you had housing prices going up in a bubble, and so people felt that they were becoming wealthier, and so they felt that they could consume more, even though they had low savings rates, right? And I think we're sort of seeing the downside of that now, where people are relying upon these kind of bubbles to finance their consumption. So I mean, it's another example. I mean, this is focused more on monetizable wealth, but certainly the bubbles that occur with some of these monetizable forms of wealth should lead one to be a little bit cautious about that. But I guess hindsight is 2020, when it comes to that. I guess one point I would say is that it just emphasizes the importance of wealth, and that that it's not just the income that people have that influences their consumption behavior. They're also influenced by some of these wealth effects.
Yeah, it's almost like with the housing bubble, we had this sense of wealth that wasn't really there, and so people were drawing wealth out that was basically in some sense of house of cards.
Right.
But it seems to go beyond that in terms of people consuming things when they don't have any money in the bank.
Yeah, I think there's a cultural aspect of this, and that there could be changes in the culture that are happening, where it's more acceptable than it used to be to just borrow a lot, and even the kind of social stigma associated with going bankrupt or something may be less than it used to be.
Yeah. So when you mentioned you were looking for gaps in the literature as you did this, where did you see the major gaps?
So in terms of, I was looking at the question for Rick and Alex. The question is about the gaps. Where do we see the main gaps in the literature? And I'll let you guys respond if you want as well. But from my point of view, as I thought about this framework, it was helpful in identifying, looking at particular wealth creation opportunities, and where do I think the gaps are. I think it seems to be especially understanding the interactions among different types of wealth, and understanding the dynamics of different types of wealth. So you have a lot of people doing literature on particular types of wealth. So there's a vastly rapidly growing literature on social capital, for example, and then you got other people doing research on natural capital, and somebody else is doing research on another type of capital. But you don't see much where people are trying to bring those things together and say, well, how do you build an effective strategy, thinking of you can't just build on one type of capital. So for decision makers at local levels, they need to understand about how these different types of wealth interact, and then if there's sort of an order of precedence, or should I invest first in this type of capital and then build on that, and think of developing other types of capital later, or do they all need to go together? Those are some of the issues that I don't see much addressed in the literature.
The sequencing.
Yeah, the sort of sequencing. And then just understanding the dynamics, what's actually happening to wealth over time. I mean, it's not even being measured. So part of the reason we don't understand these issues of sequencing is because we're not even trying to measure, the wealth and how it's changing, or different types. And I mean, even the most basic notions of wealth, of like, even if you just limit yourself to sort of, financial and physical sort of monetizable assets, you find very little literature on that, on how much of those kinds of assets do you have in rural areas, and how are those changing over time. So there's a lot that's needed on, just measuring wealth of different types, understanding how they change, and then trying to learn about the dynamics and the interactions. I don't know. Do you guys have any other comments on that, or?
And while you're asking your colleagues, I'll remind folks that we do have the researchers asked a question here that they'd like to use the chat box on. If you want to see a topic, more research on a topic, go ahead and put that in the chat box. And then Debbie asked about community forums on capital or community investment. Does that help if you start a dialogue? Did you see anything in the literature about that, about kind of a dialogue on the future of the community and how investment might help over the long term build wealth?
So let me actually, sorry, Scott, I'd taken off my headset for a second because I
Okay.
wanted to listen to what Rick Reeder was responding, but I think what he responded actually relates to what you're just asking a little bit, because Rick was saying that as you think about these different types of wealth, and how the investments in different types of wealth often need to be made by different actors at different levels, and so it kind of raises the importance of coordination at a community or region, or even a regional level. That the most effective way to have an investment strategy, for some types of assets, you're not going to build entire road networks, community by community. You have to understand for what works for a region, but then how do you integrate that with some things that have to happen at a local level. And so this is where kind of an argument for sort of regional approaches come in. But I think that's I think it relates somewhat to what you were just asking.
Okay, yeah, good. So basically the answer to Debbie's question is that you feel like dialogue would help. And
dialogue definitely helps, and we presented this to people at USDA's Rural Development Agency, and they I mean, some of them are out there trying to promote some of this kind of dialogue, and an example would be there's a program called Stronger Economies Together that Rural Development is funding, and that's meant to sort of be, well, promoting dialogue and capacity building at the local level, sort of bringing in some of the university partners, to provide training and capacity on some of these issues of how to identify effective opportunities and how to conduct sort of strategic planning and things. And so it's meant to facilitate this kind of development of local capacity, and bridging it or linking it to external capacities that as sort of technical capacity that can help with these planning processes.
well, great. Thanks a lot for that. And I think we are a little